All right. Good enough. They're late. They're late. So hello. Again, my name is Chris. I'm a partner engineer. In fact, I'm the head of partner engineering for mobile at Oculus. My job is to work with folks that are building games and other non-game experiences, particularly for Gear VR, and help them make it better, whatever problems they may have, whether it be performance or game design or just wanting to chat about the logistics of the game that they're building. Me and my team work on the sort of nitty-gritty production problems. And I'm very happy today to talk to you or be the moderator for this session, which is important to me because it's actually not about Oculus. It's about folks that are successful in VR with original content that they're developing. And at Oculus Connect, I mean, there's a lot of Oculus talking to our devs and telling us about how great all the cool stuff that we're building is. But this is actually an opportunity to talk to folks who have built their own things on top of our platform and are actually solving real-world problems, actually have real products out in the market, and talk to them about how they did that, sort of what sort of problems they overcame, and what sort of experiences they had. So to start, I would like to have my wonderful panel here just introduce yourselves. So you can maybe say your name, a little bit of information about the work that you've done, games you're shipping, things like that.
Cool. So I am McNeill. I'm a solo indie game designer from San Diego. I've released 2 games on the Gear VR so far. The first one was Darknet, which was a Gear VR Innovator Edition launch title. And that's like a cyberpunk hacking puzzle game. And then my second game was Tactera, which released in May of this year. It had a demo in December of last year. And that's a tabletop real-time strategy game. And then my third game, called Skylight, was announced just yesterday morning. It's a simultaneous turn-based tactics space battles game, which is quite a mouthful. And hopefully I'll be able to talk about all of this today.
Hi, I'm Nick Vasconcellos, and I'm a founder at TurboButton. We're located down in LA, and our release Gear VR titles right now are Adventure Time, Magic Man's Head Games, which is a third-person platformer based on the Adventure Time IP from Cartoon Network, and Floor Plan, which is a puzzle adventure game that takes place entirely in an elevator. And yeah, and we're still currently doing mobile development today.
Hey, I'm Theresa, co-founder at Temple Gates Games here in the Bay Area. And we have 3 VR titles on mobile. First was Bazaar, which is a flying carpet game we originally made for the Oculus VR Jam. We did Discovery VR, and most recently released Ascension VR. So we're super excited about the social multiplayer, especially board game space.
Hi, I'm Stephane, Intissar from OZWE. We are based in Switzerland. And so far we have released 3 games. One is VR Theory, which is basically a post-apocalyptic Angry Birds, and Showers 1, and more recently Showers 2. So it's a space shooter, space arcade shooter.
So I invited these folks particularly to come and be on this panel today because not only are they successful VR developers, they are all successful Gear VR mobile game developers that have shipped multiple products. And actually, there's a very small number of people in the world who can claim that. And of the people who can, this is the cream of the crop. These are some of the most successful Gear VR developers in the world today. So the purpose of this talk is to just talk to them about their development experience, and I'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for audience questions if you would like to talk to this panel as well. So the first question that I wanted to ask was, developing for mobile VR is pretty different than developing for PC VR or some other non-VR platform. I'm interested in how you chose the games that you decided to build. What was your thought process in choosing those particular games for Gear, for mobile VR platform, over something else? Do you want to start?
I'd love to. So actually, when I started on my first mobile VR game, which was Darknet, the cyberpunk game, I didn't know that I was making it for mobile VR. I was doing this back in the DK1 days. And so I always try to design my games around the constraints of the platform and my constraints of development. And so what I was looking at was limited performance because VR is hard, and limited tracking because the DK1 only had rotational tracking. And so as it happens, that turned out to be a pretty good analog for the limitations of mobile VR, and Darknet sort of ended up fitting better for mobile VR than it did for PC-based VR. It's also on the Rift, but I feel like it's sort of more at home on the Gear VR. And so I looked at those constraints and I tried to think about how I could turn those weaknesses into strengths. And so I was looking at like simple graphics that I could use. Well, in Cyberpunk, if you're inside a computer, everybody knows that looks like wireframe geometric shapes. So perfect, that sounds low poly. And then I was looking at ways of being able to like display the game and like present the player with a lot of interesting gameplay options. And so I would set the all the puzzles so that they're like surrounding you in all directions. And that ended up fitting really well for mobile VR in particular because it's untethered and you can look around 360 degrees, really good for swivel chair VR. And so I kind of like took these features of the platform, tried to find things that I could do with them that felt interesting or that could be strengths of the game, and then fleshed out the rest of the game around that skeleton. And I feel like it turned out pretty well. It's sort of like trying to take these, I think I found the best metaphor for that already.
So, if you don't mind me asking, how long did that process take? Like from going from a originally sort of DK2 based game to something that you figured out worked better on mobile? Like, was it like one day you woke up and you're like, oh, this should be mobile, or like what was the transition like between those two?
Well, it was a DK1 title to start with.
Okay.
So it was very early on, and I sort of, when I was trying to decide on how to schedule out development, I said like, okay, December 2014 is the worst case scenario, the earliest possible date that the Oculus Rift could launch. And then the Oculus Rift did not launch then, but the Gear VR Innovator Edition did. And so Oculus was kind enough to come to me since I had made my game visible to them. I built it for a game jam that they set up. And Oculus came to me and showed me the early version of the Gear VR before it was publicly announced and gave me the opportunity to develop for it. And so I was impressed by what the hardware could do operating off of a mobile phone from the beginning. And it seemed like sort of this, a very natural choice. Like, I had to put in a lot of extra work to get the game performant on a phone, but fundamentally it should have worked from the very beginning. Like I sort of lucked out that I was making this very graphically simple but stylized game, which fits well on the Gear. It didn't need much in the way of input. It pretty much had like a forward button and a back button. And lo and behold, the Gear VR has those two buttons. So it was very fortuitous in a way. And I feel like I sort of lucked into that with Darknet and then intentionally followed that pattern with my subsequent games.
Thank you.
I think initially for us, getting started on Gear VR was largely a business decision. It was actually one of the selling points for Cartoon Network when they were looking at VR as a possible platform to put something on. And as soon as they saw like when it would be coming out and what kinds of potential sales numbers there were, they were very interested in saying, okay, this is going to get this VR experience out into a bunch of people's hands. It'll have higher visibility than if we're just doing something that's straight up R&D and we'll just put up on Oculus Share or something like that. Because we were initially pitching it almost as like a booth demo, but then the Gear VR was announced and all that, and they got really excited. And so that's kind of where we got started. I mean, as developers, we were on board. We knew that it would be a challenge we hadn't really faced before, but it sounded like a great deal, and it worked out really well. I mean, Adventure Time is a very simple cartoon. Simple art style is kind of the same thing with E, where it's like, we can keep this within spec pretty well. And actually, one really nice thing after going through all that and getting it onto Gear VR was that we wanted to bring it to PC. And when that came around, I mean, it really didn't take much because we could just kind of like turn on lights and do a little bit, some shader work here and there, and voila, we had something that worked on PC as well. So that was like, that ended up working out really well for us as a studio as well, because it got us a lot more exposure. A lot more people could touch the game more immediately. And then for floor plan, so the entire game takes place in an elevator, and that was actually the result of a game jam, a global game jam, a few years ago. And we initially were trying to think about kind of on the DK1 train of thought of just like, what can we do that doesn't even mess with locomotion at all? We just don't want to solve that problem in a weekend or whatever for Global Game Jam, and kind of came out with this like puzzle kind of mechanic where you get to travel to different places, but never actually move from the elevator. We kind of had set that aside for a while we were working on Adventure Time, and then came back to it. And when we were looking at, what would be the best platform for that game, again, mobile seemed like a great answer. It had very simple input. It's just tapping on the side of the headset. It was all designed around one button to begin with, and it was all gaze-based. So again, we decided to go with mobile because we could get it into more people's hands more quickly. And also the art style once again lent itself well to that platform. And then at the same time, partway through development again, we were like, well, we could actually also release this on Rift simultaneously if we take a week or something. And again, because of all the constraints around performance on Gear VR, we were able to just do some shader work and turn on some lights and ship a version on the PC version, or on PC as well, and once again kind of get more exposure and get more people's hands on it.
Well, the first time I tried VR, I was in a virtual world, and I was really compelled by the environment around me. And I tried moving forward, and I almost knocked over a coffee table because I didn't know how to interact with it. And so I started thinking about this problem and thinking about interaction and people, a new audience coming into VR. And what I came up with was this flying carpet metaphor. It was this way that you could tell a user that they're going to be able to explore the world while, with a simple metaphor, a carpet, teaching them that they're not going to be moving their feet, they're not going to be walking around the room that they're physically occupying. And so when we first started doing VR, we did the Oculus VR Jam, which I think some of my other panelists have participated in. And so that was our first experience developing for VR, and it was specifically a mobile jam. So we took this flying carpet metaphor, brought it into VR, and it made a ton of sense for mobile because in mobile you have that freedom, the tetherlessness of the headset to be looking all around, taking advantage of that 360 degrees of visual freedom, which made a lot of sense for our flying carpet metaphor because you're flying with your eyes, you're steering your carpet with your head. So we've moved on from this, it was originally this procedurally generated sort of roguelike endless runner, which was bizarre, and we started doing board games. And board games are very social. And so one thing we want to do is still continue to do VR development for mobile because it brings in an additional audience. As much as we can capture as many people as possible into our VR games, we're going to deliver a better experience for our users. So we're still paying a ton of attention to what you can get with mobile. And additionally, I think mobile, it resonates with an audience that wants something that might be more accessible, it's cheaper, and we have a really small team. So we can deliver products with a scope that is going to be appropriate for what that mobile audience is looking for.
On our side, so we started with DK1. When we received the DK1, I was blown away. That was so great that I saw that making a game like a Rogue Squadron in VR would be great, and that would be a low-hanging fruit. And I was like, everybody told me locomotion is going to be hard. I was like, no, it's not going to be hard, and I was very naive. But then I was really obsessive and worked on putting together, some assets from the Unity Asset Store, And I come up with some sort of locomotion system that I thought was okay, like only 50% of the people were sick. But I said, okay, that's good enough for a game. I'm just going to publish it on the Share, Oculus Share at the time. I got some very good reviews, on this free game, and so at that time, Oculus was looking for some content for the Gear VR launch, and so so they invited me actually to take this game and port it to Gear VR, and then I realized that. So I started optimizing this stuff a lot. I actually liked it. It was really hard, really really hard. I felt really proud in optimizing all this thing. And by the end of right before the launch, Oculus told me, yeah, it's still not good. The locomotion system is still not good. So I just changed it overnight, ship it back, and they love it. And so, yeah. So basically, overnight, I come up with like everybody else was coming with the same solution, which is like the swivel chair, right? Turning around, standing up. But at that time, nobody was really talking with everybody, with each other. So it was really secret. No one knew what the others were doing. I didn't know that Eric was working on your stuff. And so come up with this solution. They loved it and shipped. Tremendous success. And then Intro was 2.
Thanks. So I would like to get into, now that you guys have shipped Gear VR games and are making new Gear VR games, I'm interested in your design process. Like, now that you have some experience on the platform, when you go to build something new, what's the most important part of your design? What are the constraints that are most important to you? And we talk about presence a lot, and I think one of the comments I hear when I talk about mobile VR to people is that, well, the fidelity isn't as good, so it's going to be difficult to achieve presence. I'm interested in how you feel about that. Is presence a goal of yours? And if so, what are the things that you use to sort of work towards it? And just generally, what are the important design sort of considerations, or what's most important to you now that you've had some experience, had some success? Do you want to start?
For me, it's controls. Really, on all the games that we've done, we spent, I would say, at least 30% of the time, of the R&D time on controls. So really being obsessive about control, just trying to get the most perfect thing for the user, basically for the player. And we start with this, and then we find limitation, and then we build levels around those limitations. And then the graphics also came after that, trying also to embrace those limitations. So it's really going from the controls, then level design, and then graphics arts. That's for us. That's how we work. This is the order of things.
Presence is the buzzword of VR development, and I used to get a little burnt out on hearing about presence all the time until I took a flight and I tried my VR headset on my flight. And if you know me, you know that I have a fear of flying, and I can't stand being on an airplane. I'm just in a panic all the time. And I found that VR really helped me with this fear. The first time that I was trying VR on a flight, after about an hour, I noticed that there was a big difference in just the way I was able to cope. My hands that are usually sweating bullets were dry, and my heart that's usually beating out of my chest was just calm. And I thought, there's really something here. So since then, I've been working on games that hopefully will just be massively appealing to everyone, but I have a secret agenda of trying to make games that will help me when I'm on a flight. And that's when I really want to have that presence, because what I don't want is to have any inkling that I'm on an airplane 30,000 feet above the ground, completely untethered. I want to lose myself in this virtual reality, this ability to replace the world that I feel like I'm in right now. And so, while you have sort of the headphones in if you're on mobile VR, which is something you can take on a plane, which is great. You have the headphones in, you can replace the sounds of the engine with the sounds of a game. You can replace, you have a complete visual monopoly because every pixel, every photon that you're seeing is coming from a screen, and that's something that you're electing to look at rather than an airplane, which is, you bought your ticket, so technically you elected to be on that plane, but you might not really want to be looking at the airplane. So that's where I think that presence can really help. I hear a lot about exposure therapy, and personally, I think that VR has an opportunity to solve problems for people in a pretty diametrically opposed way, which is to completely, rather than get someone used to a particular stimuli, to completely remove that stimuli from their lives. So I'm really excited about people pushing research in this direction. I'm super biased myself, so it doesn't make a ton of sense for me to be prescribing this to everyone. But I'm really excited to see what the community develops in this direction.
I've kind of thought about, I guess I debate on saying this, but I'm not entirely, I think there are certain experiences where presence can be super powerful and incredibly important. I think when we are often thinking about our games, or at least I won't rope all of Turbo Button into this, but it's just like I'm always thinking about a sense of place, which is very similar to presence, I think, but presence to me seems more like I have to actually believe that I'm in this place, whereas sense of place to me seems more like this world is cohesive in some way that just either just gets me excited, or maybe I do feel like I'm actually there, but that's not necessarily a requirement. And for our games, a lot we try to do this a lot through like characters and animation. I think like you've heard plenty of talks about people saying like, oh, when a character looks at you or waves at you or something, that can be super powerful, and I think that's incredibly true. And there is something in your brain that kind of triggers and kind of wants to wave back or whatever. And so I think like for us, a lot of our design process early on is thinking about how do we get these characters to, even if they don't necessarily feel real, feel like they are a part of that world and are kind of inviting you to be in there with them. And I think kind of on a more like technical note too, when, especially without positional tracking on Gear VR, we're constantly trying to figure out ways to bring stuff closer to your face, so you get like the nice stereoscopic effect. In Adventure Time, it worked out pretty well because we are scaling up the camera, so everything does feel a little bit closer to you. And actually, at the very beginning of the game, we start you off really tiny, and then like basically rip your eyes apart from each other as you get blown up into a balloon fictionally. And all of a sudden, like there's people always commenting like, oh, it suddenly feels like the 3D got turned on or something to that effect. And I think it's stuff like that that really makes the world feel close to you. But then on top of that, even just little things of putting stuff in between you and a character, even if it's just passing by, can actually feel very interesting, even if it's just subliminally, that really make you feel anchored in that world. And like in Floor Plan, we don't do any scaling of the camera or anything like that. And for a while, we were kind of struggling with how do we make a game. We were interested in the concept or whatever, but how do we make a game where like you are specifically and intentionally separated from the places that you're traveling to by this like doorway, feel like you are still present in those worlds, and a lot of it was kind of trying to figure out how those worlds almost like leak into the elevator at certain times, and so did just a few things like, I mean, you're always holding some kind of item that's always just you're always holding some kind of item that's like floating up next to you, and there's one floor that takes place in like a freezer, and when you open up the doors on that floor, you get like cold breath coming out of your face, and everybody who tries it freaks out like the first time. Like, oh, whoa, what was that? Like, was it reacting to me? Like, and it's just like those little touches, and they don't even necessarily come in early on. Those are kind of polished things, but it's all those little things I think that add up toward the end that really kind of cement that sense of place.
So I think these three have given a lot of good answers already. And I'd echo them in saying that like my design process is kind of a conversation between my fantasies of the game I want to create and the constraints and affordances of the hardware I'm working with. So I look at, oh, it can do 3D effects, and that feels really cool. So I want to like put things up close to you, and the controls are a limitation, and so I'm going to focus on those a lot. Try to find something that feels really good. Or you can look around and everything, it's the world surrounds you, so I want to create this immersive setting that gives you a sense of place and envelops you. But I wouldn't say that I'm focused on presence so much, with this feeling of actually being in a space. And I want to present a potentially controversial idea to my fellow panelists, which I don't know if I believe this, but this is kind of the anxiety that keeps me up at night. So my games tend to be like strategy games, where a lot of the gameplay is sort of taking place in your own head. That's where the interesting thing is happening. It's the gameplay dynamics, as opposed to sort of more physical gameplay, where it's more reaction-based or more about a feeling of actual bodily presence in a space. That feeling that I think you get really well from some of the touch demos that we saw yesterday and today. And so part of me wonders if the strengths of VR lend themselves to those more physical types of gameplay. And just my style of as a game designer is more mental. And that maybe my games are a better fit on mobile VR as opposed to PC VR, because mobile VR is worse at what VR is good at. Maybe mobile VR is just the lesser VR. And maybe my ideas aren't good for VR, and that's why I tend towards mobile VR. Now I don't really fully believe that. That's like when my mind goes to a dark place, but I think there might be some truth there. I think them's fighting words, and I'm wondering if you guys think there might be a nugget of truth in there.
Yeah, somebody want to take a shot at that?
Man.
Or we could just all cry ourselves to sleep and move on to the next question.
I don't know. I think you said a lot there. But I don't know that it's necessarily lesser, I guess. It all depends. I guess it all depends on what you're striving for. I think kind of what you're describing, actually, of more like a cerebral game. We were kind of running into that issue on floor plan, and not issue necessarily, but for our game in particular, that cerebral portion was initially boring. Because we didn't have a lot of other stuff going on, it kind of felt like dead space rather than like thinking time. But, oh man, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, you kind of threw me for a loop here, man.
I have a couple comments on that in defense of mobile VR. I think that one thing that's an easy win with VR is these sort of party trick style designs where you have something coming out at you and you really get that stereoscopic effect, and that feels really good, and it's easy to achieve as a developer. But I think also there's a lot of space for strategy, and one of the things that so I come from a strategy game background. My first indie game was called Cannonball, sort of a artillery RTS, and I mean what I see in strategy games over and over is multiplayer. And I think that VR has a huge opportunity for multiplayer, and that's when you're going to get some of these really rich cerebral exercises, because you're going to be battling with someone else. And I think mobile VR, I mean, you're on a phone, it's got a microphone built in, it's got speakers, it's ready for a social experience. If we can just get the tech up so that we can get more people into the games, because right now you're having CPU limitations on voice blending and encoding and decoding and things like that. But the phone is so ready for these strategic multiplayer experiences, so in defense of mobile VR.
Okay, I don't think a mobile VR is lesser than the worst thing. So I'm just wearing my engineering hat here, and I believe developing for mobile is really healthy. So it's always good to start on mobile, and you actually uncover so many things that you do really wrong that it's good and to move. It's better to do that and then move to PC. I think there is no. I mean, you can have a fast action game on Gear VR. I think I don't know how much you have played Intro Wars 2, but if you play a multiplayer session with a really good guy, I mean, you're going to be tired at the end, right? Because they're so good and you have to turn around and find them and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, it doesn't really depend on the, mobile has nothing to do with action, and reflection. So.
I actually think, I don't necessarily even think that it's a bad thing that maybe the strategy games might actually work better on Gear VR. I kind of think about when I put on like a Rift at my PC, I'm playing more like in this position. Like I'm sitting up, like I'm ready, I want to be able to lean and move and stuff like that. But when I put on a Gear VR, like I want to sit back a little bit. I want to be able to relax. I want to be able to have that, time in between turns or whatever. And I think, at least for me, I'm very attracted to those kinds of experiences because that's how I like to experience games that aren't VR as well, like something that is more relaxing or I can play at my own pace. And to me, it seems that mobile VR is like a great platform for that kind of thing.
You guys have convinced me. Yeah, and I think like, summing up what I've heard is, in part like, first of all, as it's not true that like all actiony stuff is lesser on mobile VR, and then secondly that strategy, of course, has a place in VR. It's not like you're going to say like VR is good for presence, strategy doesn't care about presence, therefore there should be no strategy games in VR. That would be a stupid thing to say. And then yeah, like it's comfortable. There's going to be room for thinking games, and tetherless, convenient, accessible mobile VR is probably a really good place for them. So thanks, guys. I'll keep making games.
Well, actually, I had a question that I wasn't sure we were going to get to. That now that we've talked about it, it's actually about player agency, and agency is kind of a lofty game design academic term that usually is used to mean, why does the player do what they do, and how does the player interact with the game? And I guess when we're talking about it in terms of VR, we could talk about, what's the control system, what are the short-term and long-term goals of your game design, like what are the things that are sitting there reinforcing whatever outcome the game wants the player to have. If you know me, you know that I'm a big horror aficionado, and I take every opportunity to relate anything that we're talking about to horror games. But the discussion you just had reminded me that within horror games, there's sort of two very clearly defined camps. There's the folks that like the slow-paced, scary stuff where not very much happens. You walk instead of run. And there's the ones where you shoot zombies in the face. And those are both horror games, but they're very different, and the types of agency that they afford is very different. I think the audiences are actually fairly different as well, even though they're sort of thematically similar. So I'm wondering how you think about it, particularly on Gear VR. One of the constraints that you mentioned is that you may have a control pad, or you may just have a little touch pad on the side. Your sort of input options are a little bit limited. So I'd like you to talk about how you think about player agency, or specifically like, you kind of said cerebral versus sort of action-oriented, but I think that's kind of the same thing. If you're going out building a new game for Gear VR today, what do you think that audience wants? What do you think that hardware is appropriate for?
So one thing that I've done, I don't know the general answer for this, but I feel like I landed on a solution that feels to me sort of like a cheat that works pretty well, which is abstracting everything that the player is interacting with. Where a game like Job Simulator gets a lot of its joy from touching things that represent actual objects and again sort of the physicality, like tying into the previous discussion. I think I when I can't do that perfectly, I prefer to not pretend and not try to get close to it, but instead to sort of divert towards something completely different. So in my first game, the entire game is set in cyberspace. Literally the whole game is one big graphical user interface. And so I can define how it works and what the affordances are and how the player interacts with it. So to me, that feels more natural to just be limited to like looking at buttons and tapping on them because you're living in a computer world anyway. You're not expecting to be able to reach out and feel cyberspace because you don't have like a basis for that. And then in my subsequent games, I decided to set the entire game where you're in like a real physical space, but all the gameplay is a projected hologram of your tanks or spaceships or what have you. And so the thought there was, again, you're not going to feel this need to like reach out and grab them or something, or to like to walk through the battlefield. I'm setting an interface inside of a video game, and that seems like one way of kind of sidestepping the agency problem and making it feel natural that the way you would interact with it is through more limited means, like gaze controls.
I'm going to pass for a moment.
Okay.
So what we found at Templegates games is there's a huge tension right now in VR. Job Simulator was mentioned. They have done a wonderful job at delivering a very one-to-one relationship between the player and the objects in the world and how you're going to use those objects. There's a lack of abstraction that they've achieved. And I think there's something super magical there. And a lot of VR developers right now are trying to find a lot of places you can remove abstraction out to get these magical VR moments. There's a couple problems here. One is that if you don't have everything, if you have some things, a mug or a crossbow or whatever it is around your player, if you have some things of those be interactable, but not others, or you don't sort of deliver on all the interactions and permutations between the items, you can get a lot of frustration on the player end, having to try to sort of guess and check everything they can interact with. And another thing is, especially in mobile VR, when you don't have that positional tracking, you have to find a way to put these items within reach of your player. For Job Simulator, you're at a cubicle, and so it all kind of sort of works out that everything is right in reach. But there's a lot of environments you might want to explore in VR that don't have all the objects within reach. So one thing that we ended up sort of stumbling on is this sort of gaze grappling sort of like mechanic where you can, look at an item and then it gets sort of just magnetically grabbed towards your player. And that's one way you can sort of deal with that problem. But in general, having that lack of abstraction is sometimes a big burden on your user who doesn't know how to interact with these things, because this is a really novel way of approaching games. If you think back about the history of video games, it has been super, super symbolic for a very long time. You've got Pong, you've got Minesweeper. These are circles and squares and symbols. And so when you start removing those abstractions, people might not necessarily know how to interact with things. So we had one system in our first game, which was a system of gestures where you would nod your head yes or shake your head no to accept or reject a quest or move along through a tutorial. And one of the problems was people are so unfamiliar with just having those one-to-one interactions that they didn't know how to interact with it. We got all kinds of different behaviors when you prompt someone to nod their head. So what we ended up doing was coming back to a button that says yes or no, and people get that 100% of the time. So it might not be sexy, it might not be cool, but people really know how to interact with it. So the lesson that we learned is you really have to be judicious in what kind of realistic interactions you put out there, what kind of innovations in interaction you're doing. Give a digestible amount, have one new interaction, for a period of time before you introduce another, because you can kind of overwhelm the user really easily.
So on our side, on Intissar Wars, really we still, because it's a game where you're moving all the time, you're actually moving to the action that you want to perform. So if you want to get a bonus, you have your ship going to that thing, just pick it up. So we didn't really have this problem, as I remember. Now, the limitation of the inputs wasn't that bad because, for example, when the first version that we did was on the DK1, and so we mapped the controls like turning left, right, on the key, moving forward, moving backward, on the keyboard, and we played. And suddenly we realized that we only pressed the forward button all the time. So when we switch and say, okay, in Intissar words, the only thing you can do is move forward, it seemed natural. So we didn't have any problem with it.
This isn't actually about my own games, actually, but there was kind of on the topic of interaction and kind of grabbing things just with like a gaze-based interface. During the Gear VR Jam, there was a game, I think, called Wendy, and it was just this small game where you are sitting in a chair with a little cat on your lap, and you are like finding, it's almost like hidden objects-ish, and then you're putting things in a cauldron and making spells and stuff. And they had this really interesting mechanic, kind of, where you're using gaze-based to pick everything up and whatever, but as you're kind of cursoring over objects, they kind of wiggle a little bit. And I kind of noticed as I was playing, it was interesting, there's all these like jars and stuff on the shelf, and like I noticed that it was actually reacting to how fast I would move my head, and if I moved too fast, it would actually knock things off the shelf. And these are things like across the room, nothing I was actually touching, but my brain immediately understood the metaphor of like, oh, I am reaching out and touching these things, and that's how I kind of manipulate these things in the world. And it was just that small touch that really kind of resonated with me, and I didn't have any problem kind of accepting that something didn't need to be within arm's reach. And actually, like on our current game, like I've been thinking about that a lot as well. Just trying to, it's a way to kind of make the environment feel more alive as well, even if it's not super close to you.
So I want to ask about 2 more questions, and then we'll break it out for questions from the audience. But first, I wanted to ask, talk about a time in development of your Gear games where you had an idea and it failed. Or you went down a road of development, you got a certain way on there, and it didn't work out, and you had to back up. I'm interested in what those things were, but also what the result was of did you just go back to square one, or did you learn something? Like, tell us a little bit about times where it didn't work. Stephane, you want to start?
So in Intissar worlds, I was trying to create a planet. So you would fly over a planet, and so I was following the rules that was dictated by Oculus, which says, okay, you have to have constant velocity or linear locomotion, linear motion. And so I made the environment. I usually feel a lot of the motion sickness. And I was comfortable, so I was happy with the result. And so I gave the headset to my colleague and said, okay, can you try it? And after a while, everybody said, okay, I'm sick. It doesn't work. And I could not understand why it didn't work. In the end, I understood that what people do when they're flying over a planet is they go to the planet. Go directly to very close to the ground. And what happened there is that I decided to put some detailed textures that would fade in when you are very close to the ground. And I realized then that it's not about constant velocity, it's about perceived motion. And if you have, for example, textures that have very high frequencies, like stripes or little stones on the wall, then your brain suddenly understands that as a very strong acceleration because it can perceive a lot of velocity. And so I realized that in that case, I had to fix that. I had to use textures that have much lower frequencies, like really not much details on the textures, and that works very well. And then. Knowing that, I did the opposite. Actually, I made the ship always accelerate based on the altitude. So the higher you go, the higher you go, the faster your ship is going. But because it's not seeing a lot of pixels moving, you don't feel that use acceleration.
I think everyone here, as a VR developer, probably would agree that in VR you're most often failing, and at least in these early days, like I think it takes, you know, a zillion tries and stabs at something to arrive at a successful solution, especially on your first projects. So it's hard to narrow down one specific failure that stands out. But one thing that we did with our first game, Bazaar, was we started by putting our UI in the sky, in the constellation. So we literally had a heads-up display above you. And you know, at first when we implemented this, we thought, oh, it's so cool. We're taking advantage of all the 360 degrees of real estate. You can put your UI in. But it was a massive failure because of a number of reasons. For one, if you ask your users to look up, it's really uncomfortable. And we found that even though you have a ton of space all around you in VR to display content that people are going to interact with, they really want the content in this pretty narrow range in front of them. And that's because VR doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Like people, your users have been interacting with other people. They've been interacting with their TVs, their computers, their consoles, their calculators. Everything is always presented right in front of you. You're not trying to turn to the left and the right and up and down. So once we got away from that UI metaphor of putting things in the stars, we had a lot more success with people liking our games.
Yeah, when we were developing Adventure Time, you know, I was talking earlier about getting stuff up in kind of your VR sweet spot. We had, you know, Jake, the stretchy dog, who would like come out of the backpack and kind of talk with you and all this kind of stuff. And there's a character called, I don't know how familiar you guys are with Adventure Time, but Lumpy Space Princess is this purple blob drama queen character, is like the best way I can describe her. And throughout the course of the story, at one point she falls in love with you. And at one point we had this really awesome moment. I was really excited about it. We didn't have a whole lot of time for like prototyping all of our story moments, but I was like, no, this is going to work. But the idea was she'd get so in love with you that she would come up and like give you a hug, where she'd basically just be like hugging your face. And I don't know, the show is very silly, but it's also kind of awkward at times. So I was very excited about this like silly, awkward moment where she's just way too close and encroaching on your personal space. And yeah, we had already like recorded VO and all this kind of stuff. And the day I go to like implement it and set it up and put in all our animations and everything, and she just like flies up to me and I'm like, all right, here it goes. Like she starts coming in for the hug, and when she gets here, it's just purple, like all of it, everything. Well, this doesn't feel like she's hugging me at all. Like, this is super weird. Tried a bunch of different stuff. Like, her arms didn't quite go around you, so we like made them really long for that moment, or thick, and like just tried to make her make different noises and stuff, and that was really weird. And it was just a big old fail on that. And you know, it was the kind of thing where we were, you know, trying to almost doing too much with this whole bringing characters up in your face. You know, we got way too excited about it, and while I wish it would have worked and been in the game, it just didn't end up being comfortable or nearly as interesting as we wanted it to be at the end of the day. So for that, I mean, I think the lesson there is just like trying to prototype those things much earlier on, and yeah, don't shove characters in your face.
First, I want to say that this topic of like lessons learned from failed experiments in VR, there's a whole talk about this happening immediately after ours. Nick's co-founder Holden is talking there, and you should all go see that because I'm sure it's going to be full of lessons like these. On my own game, on Darknet, for anybody who hasn't seen it, basically, you know, you're hacking nodes because that's what you do as a cyberpunk hacker. And the nodes are spheres that are sort of wrapping all around you, and you can see them all at once, and you're in like the center of, you know, this big group of them. But that's not how it started out. In my original envisioning of the game, it was like a 3D network of nodes, because VR, 3D, right? Of course it's going to work. And so you'd go inside one, and then they might be anywhere around you, and you could travel from one to another by like traveling through the tubes, the internet. Of course, this didn't work at all in practice, because sometimes you'd enter a node, and you can't see any of the others because they're occluded by other nodes. Or you want to see which one you're looking at, but that's also like the tube that travels towards it. So it's a UI element, and you can't tell what's beyond it. And then sometimes they're directly above you or directly below you, and it's really uncomfortable, or just nobody ever goes to look at them. So it clearly didn't work. And I think, I tried that, and once I did that, I was sort of like, this is actually really obviously uncomfortable. And I can't believe I didn't realize this. I can't believe I was like fantasizing about this game that was so unworkable for so long. And so to take Nick's point one step further, of like prototype this stuff as early as you can. I think the first round of prototyping is just really taking a moment to try and envision it, and try and imagine what it feels like, and actually like look around, close your eyes, and try to see it. And a lot of the time you will catch these awkward moments before you even have to write the first line of code.